Now let's get into kind of the more serious topics for the pod today. Big news out about Michigan and Jim Harbaugh, where Michigan will self-impose a 3-game suspension for Jim Harbaugh beginning this season. Now, their schedule is not good. In the vein of they're going to walk over these teams early. When I saw this, and the first I saw it, it was on Twitter, and I think Bruce tweeted it out. I know he didn't report it, but he tweeted it out. And the first thing that I remember thinking to myself is oh my gosh, who cares? What are we doing? I don't know if you have that thought like I did, but that's immediately what I thought. And then it made me sit there and I think to myself well, who would care, right? Well, let's talk about this. Does it mean anything? And I'm thinking about all this, and I come to the conclusion that if you're worried about this particular infraction, if you're worried about the fairness of the number of games or who imposes the suspension or whether the NCAA will take into account this suspension in the first place, I think that your eyes are in the wrong direction. I don't think that's a diversion. It's a diversion. And you're probably a Michigan fan or an Ohio State fan, right? If you're sitting there no, Harbaugh, he should have more games. He lied. Or you're a Michigan fan and you're it was a cheeseburger. Somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle. But that's not what this is all about for me. Let's talk about what this is all about. To me, this is a symptom of a completely broken institution. And that institution is obviously the NCAA. The NCAA is archaic. They are slow. They are inept. And they're inconsistent. Not good descriptors for an organization that's the so-called governing body of intercollegiate athletics. And if you actually take a step back and you start to view this Harbaugh situation in that vein, then you start to kind of see the bigger picture. First of all, this was a COVID time period where the NCAA had no leadership whatsoever. So there wasn't standards across the country of what you could do and what you couldn't do, or how many fans you were going to let in, or whether you had to have a vaccine or a mandate or a mask or all this stuff. It's everyone, it's just Katie bar the door, everyone does their own. So it's on the hard things where it's difficult to lead, guess what the NCAA does? They throw up their hands and they totally abdicate the throne. Nope, sorry, we're not going to do that. That's too hard for us. When it comes to NIL and transfer portal, they never lead. Everything is in response to. And in large part, the reason we're in the chaotic situation that we are in currently when it relates to the transfer portal and when it relates to NIL, name, image, and likeness, is because of the ineptitude of the NCAA. I had conversations with people at the NCAA almost a decade ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And they would ask me about NIL. And they'd be like, well, what do you think about players being paid? And I'm like, well, that's the wrong question, because earning what your name, image, and likeness value is not, quote, being paid. All right. That's being compensated for your value. Now, what do I think about a school directly paying an employee of a player? That's dicey. I don't love that scenario. But we have an Olympic model where you're technically an amateur and you can enter into name, image, and likeness deals. And if you have value in your name, image, and likeness, that's yours. And so I told them this, and they were like, well, what should we do about it? And I said, you know what? I don't know exactly what you should do about it, but here's what I will tell you. You can take 2 steps now that are probably uncomfortable for you, and you might not know exactly how to take them. Or you'll be forced to take 10 steps in 5 years, and those 10 steps are going to ruin you. And they thought, well, no. And guess what's happened? Look at what's happened. That's exactly what happened. They lose case after case in terms of the litigation that's gone on out there, the O'Bannon case and so on and so forth. And they've been forced into a situation where they lost total control. And so, like, if you take a look at the way that they govern and dole out punishments, it's completely inconsistent. One school gets hammered, another school gets let off with like a slap on the wrist. And you're like, wait, hold on. Weren't those the same infractions? It's a maddening institution. They don't lead and they don't serve the best interests of the exact persons that they're trying to serve. They're there to help support the student athlete. And yet they've created a scenario because of their ineptitude and lack of action through NIL and transfer portal that those kids are operating in a space where they don't know if seats are available in the portal, where they're getting taken advantage of by agents that don't have to register with any entity in an NIL deal. And now all of a sudden, like, the exact people that they're supposed to protect, the NCAA, they're not protecting. So, like, what are we doing? So, Joel, why are you going on this rant about the NCAA when we're talking about Jim Harbaugh's self-imposed 3-game suspension? Because it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. It's born out of who's governing, how are we doling out suspensions, is there consistency? And the answer is there is none. So let's just talk about it from this standpoint. You've heard me say on this show that the Pac-12's demise to now just 4 teams was a long time in the making. 12 years, some would say, over a decade. And that the dominoes that we saw fall 2 and 3 weeks ago were actually the latest dominoes in a long line of dominoes that started falling over a decade ago. Well, that's the analogy. And now if you just place that analogy on the NCAA, I believe that the dominoes started to fall a long time ago for the NCAA. And what we're seeing today with the Harbaugh stuff, the self-imposed ban, these rules, impermissible benefits and impermissible coaching and so on and so forth, that is just a domino in the line of dominoes that will eventually run out and the NCAA will cease to exist. I would bet a lot of money on that. We are just waiting for that string of dominoes to end. And they can't end soon enough for me. Look at what the NCAA said about it. I want you, I'm going to put this up. If you're watching YouTube, you can read it. I'll read it aloud as well. The NCAA's statement about the Jim Harbaugh situation it's so tone deaf and egregiously bad. So this is this guy, Derek Crawford, and he's the vice president of hearing operations at the NCAA. He says, quote, "The Michigan infractions case is related to impermissible on and off-campus recruiting during the COVID-19 dead period and impermissible coaching activities, not a cheeseburger." Couple of thoughts on this. Number one, this is so petty. So a narrative begins out there that it was because a recruit showed up at the building and then he was fed, and then that's why the infractions took place. And the NCAA is like, it wasn't just a cheeseburger. Like all high and mighty, like they're thumbing their nose at that story when that's part of the story. And then secondly, Michigan's not even allowed to respond. So why are you out there in a PR campaign putting out statements about this, trying to get like a narrative built against a school that has joined your organization when they can't even talk about it? It doesn't make any sense. This is why, again, like the NCAA just needs to go away. This is why I don't mind when the SEC and the Big Ten garner more power and more revenue, because then hopefully that power is going to lead them to start to agree almost in an alliance fashion or a treaty fashion on the rules that govern the sport. And that agreement will govern the sport. And it will govern how punishments are doled out. And then they can say to the NCAA, pound sand. We don't need you to crown our champion, and we don't need you for governance. And they're going to leave. What that means for the other sports, I don't know. But as it relates to college football, all of us should be cheering on the imminent demise of the NCAA, which has had a large hand in ruining what was a great institution in college football.